Oh boy. What is this monstrosity? A serrated katana. Hi there, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, and I specialise in arms and armour from across history, and I'm a lifelong student of martial arts. And today we're going to be looking at some of the combat, weapons and armour from Assassin's Creed Shadows. So a very interesting character from history. He first turns up around 1581 and is supposedly someone who came to Japan with an Italian Jesuit priest and thereafter came into the service of a great Japanese lord and seems to have been some sort of retainer or bodyguard, most likely. But there's some discussion about that and the sources aren't always clear. He's mentioned in both European and Japanese sources.
Lord Nobunaga commands that the black man join you.
But he is my sword bearer, a slave. He does not speak the language.
Lord Nobunaga commands it.
As we see here, all of these people are wearing armour of various sorts and different levels. So we can see in the background here, we've got some essentially what would be called musketeers in Europe. So they have lighter armour, and then we have the sort of samurai characters, if we call them that, wearing heavier armour of the day.
You really think you stand a chance?
So one thing to note is that they carry two swords. One is the katana or uchi katana, and the other one is a shorter sword called the wakizashi. Collectively, this pair are called the daisho, and they were worn from the late 15th century onwards. Here we're presumably looking at the late 16th century. So by the 16th century, which is a great warring period in Japan, it was typical for samurai or indeed high status warriors to wear this daisho, and the daisho was seen as a sign of being a samurai, incidentally. Now, earlier on, samurai didn't wear these two swords together. They actually wore a different type of sword called a tachi, but they wore a one long sword, and very occasionally they wore a tanto, which is a knife-sized version of the wakizashi, so smaller. So in this period, they carry two weapons edge up, and that's the standard sidearm set of a samurai. However, they usually have a primary weapon, which is usually either a bow or a pole weapon, a staff weapon of some sort, but we'll look at that in a bit. Firearms were massively important in Japan in the 16th century. Obviously, gunpowder had been experimented with much earlier in China, and it had spread to Europe, Japan, and other places from there. And the Europeans by this point, by the 16th century, were widely using firearms, but they were also still using swords and armor, because remember, at this time, firearms are slow to reload, but very well made, very effective. And obviously, this changed Japanese warfare, so much so that many samurai in the 16th and 17th centuries imported European bulletproof breastplates and helmets, and these were incorporated into a new style of Japanese armor. So they lacquered them, they added the normal shoulder defenses and tassets down below and decorative styles onto the European breastplate and helmet and made them look Japanese. So sometimes you might look at them and just assume it's a completely Japanese armor, but in fact imported not just guns but also European armor, particularly the bulletproof types, were really, really popular and highly prized in Japan at the time.
Shoot him! They won't work! It's too wet!
So I absolutely love that. Now, is it realistic? Well, on a fundamental level, gunpowder is, yes, if it gets wet, it doesn't work. Okay, so one of the things I do when I've got my other hat on is I do shoot muzzle loading historic firearms. And absolutely, if you wet gunpowder, it will not work. So fundamentally, in war, in history, there have been times when the powder's got wet or even just damp and it doesn't work properly. Yasuke, in this case, kind of banked on that being the case. Now, what I would say, if you're a trained musketeer, you should know to cover it in rain. I mean, it's like learning how to operate a musket 101. Don't stand with your powder in the rain. So, straight off what I'd say is the motions, the movements are really good. They're exaggerated, but, this is a game. What do you expect? You need to be able to clearly see the movements and understand what you're doing, a lot of the fine movements of fencing or Kenjutsu are so small that you wouldn't really be able to accurately represent them in a third-person game like this. So yes, the movements are wider and more exaggerated than in real life, but they are essentially the right movements. He's cutting in the right way, so there is a manner of cutting with a Japanese sword. You can cut by throwing the tip out, what the Germans in longsword would call a Scheitelhau, but a lot of the cuts are given with a drawing motion. Okay, now I don't want to overstate that point because a lot of people in the world will tell you that a Japanese sword is always given with a drawing cut. Well, actually, kind of all swords are. But yes, if we look at the motion of most Kenjutsu movements and cutting with the sword, indeed they will often come out and then come back in an elliptical fashion. And they have represented this really well in the game. So I strongly suspect that they've gone and watched or conversed with Kenjutsu practitioners to look at the positions that they hold swords and the way that they step and cut and move. And it actually looks great. So, how plausible it is to do a Darth Vader and pick someone up. I guess if you were super, super strong and the other person was relatively light, maybe it's possible. I'm not going to say it's impossible. It's not a typical Kenjutsu move, I have to point out. Aha! So, a poisoned Naginata. So, first up, Naginata. I have no problem with the Naginata. So, essentially in Japan, there are, as well as swords, which get all of the attention, there are a variety of hafted weapons, shafted weapons, pole arms, whatever you want to call them. In other words, weapons with a long stick. Now, the Naginata is what would be termed in Europe a glaive. That is, you have a long cutting blade, not unlike a wakizashi, mounted on a stick. So essentially, that's right, it's a sword on a stick. The poison element. So this has clearly got some kind of pungent looking purple liquid on the edge of the blade. Is that something that the Japanese did? Not as far as I know. There are a number of reasons why you might not want to do that. One, how would you then put that into the saya or scabbard without it just kind of squidging everywhere and making a mess and perhaps even getting stuck in the scabbard? Here's the problem. If this has got poison on the blade, you're fighting armored opponents for the most part. How's the poison going to get into the people? So you're going to have to get through the armor first. You can't poison the armor. I don't personally know any evidence that the Japanese ever did poison their weapons like this. Would they ever stick it on a Naginata? I suspect not. I suspect that poison might be stuck on a dagger, on a stiletto, on a shuriken, something like this, but I can't really see it being put on a Naginata. So one little detail that I actually love is that he's holding the Naginata in the right place to run. If you've never held a Naginata or any other type of pole weapon, you might not think about this, but the Naginata is heavy at the blade end, okay? The point of balance of a halberd, Naginata, glaive, partisan, whatever, is pretty much where he's gripping it. If you want to hold a polearm and run, that's where you want to grip it. I like that. I like that as a detail. It's good. Do you know, the movement is really nicely done in this. You can see little lifts of the foot, like when he wants to hit, so he's come upwards, and when he wants to go down, he just lifts the foot slightly and then places it down as you bring the weapon down. These types of little shifts, whether you're leaning back on one leg, we can see that he leans on the left leg sometimes, leans on the right leg sometimes, he might lift a foot up and then place it down as he strikes. This type of weight transference and balance transference looks brilliant. It looks exactly like real people using Naginata or any other big two-handed weapon like a poleaxe. This is what it looks like. It looks literally like they filmed someone. Maybe they did motion capture. It looks completely convincing. I really like the way that he moves. And the manners of using the Naginata, yes, it's a one-edged weapon, so he's having to turn the weapon to cut with it. Whichever way he's cutting and then thrusting, it looks right. They've really got it absolutely nailed. I really like it. So this is nice. It's a training scene, and they're using wooden swords, which in Japanese martial arts are generally known as Bokken. They didn't, for the most part, train with steel swords. Okay, so typically in Kenjutsu, the standard training weapon is the Bokken for a couple of pretty obvious reasons. One, it's a lot safer. Okay, so it's a lot safer. But secondly, to save the swords, there's very little evidence for them having practice versions of steel swords made of steel in Japan. Whereas in Europe, we did have practice versions of steel swords, which eventually evolved into what you see today used in modern Olympic fencing, foils and epées and things like this. Steel was a more valuable and rarer commodity in Japan.
Yeah, I'm getting better. I am.
So one thing that bothers me is hovering weapon on back. I really wish game developers would stop doing this. It really bothers me, the fact that they always have weapons levitating magnetically on characters' backs. I'm not saying that swords were never worn on backs. There are some examples, and funnily enough, there are some examples from Japan. Okay, so we do actually have a few examples in Japanese art of swords being worn on the back for traveling. Have it down by the side, not on the back. Oh boy. What is this monstrosity? A serrated katana. Yeah, no, that wouldn't work. I am not aware of there ever having been a serrated katana in history. Oh, this is painful to watch. So not only has she got an inferior katana because it's serrated, but she's holding it the wrong way around as well. So there was one cut there where she goes through the neck. So she's come upwards, which is kind of okay, but then she turns around. How do you even cut from that angle? So that'd be a cut 2 in saber, military saber. With the, oh my gosh, bodies aren't built that way. We can't even do you just wouldn't be able to cut. I wouldn't be able to cut through paper like that. Oh dear, no, terrible. So to sum up, overall, I actually think this game looks amazing, and I'm personally looking forward to playing it. It looks really cool. I love the look of the scenery, the environments. I like the way that the opponents sort of move around, and they look quite well proportioned. It all looks quite realistic. The research on the weapons and armor seems to be top notch if we throw out the fantasy elements, okay? Really don't like that serrated katana. So overall, I really love the look of this game. I just wish there was a bit less reversed grip sword wielding, which I'm never a fan of, and I'm not sure that poison on a Naginata needed to be in there. But overall, it looks great.
For more videos like this, why not check out our review of Assassin's Creed Shadows or Matt Easton reacting to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2.